London did not measure a woman's worth in pounds that season. It measured her in vouchers. A small rectangle of paper, unsigned by anyone she had ever met, could open a door that 10,000 a year could not. Cassandra Merrick had 11 shillings to her name and no dowry worth mentioning, and yet on the second Wednesday of April, a card arrived at Varick House, addressed to her, and only her, in a hand she did not recognize. It was not a mistake. It was the beginning of the strangest night London society would talk about for a decade. The night a duke crossed the floor of the most exclusive room in England and asked the wrong woman to dance. Subscribe to Regency Lullabies and tell me in the comments where you are watching this story from tonight. The library at Varick House smelled of old leather, beeswax polish, and the particular dry sweetness of paper that had survived longer than the people who wrote on it. Cassandra sat on the floor with her skirts tucked beneath her, a damaged French edition of Montaigne open across her knees, a fine needle and a length of waxed thread in her hand. She was mending the spine the way her father had taught her. Small stitches, no glue, because glue rotted paper faster than time did. She was 23 years old, unmarried, and almost entirely invisible in a household that contained two of the most watched women in London. "You will ruin your eyes doing that by candlelight," said her aunt, Lady Vane, sweeping into the room in a dressing gown of pale blue silk, a maid trailing behind her with a tray of hairpins. "And you will ruin your hands. Nobody wishes to dance with a woman whose fingers look like a seamstress's." "Nobody wishes to dance with me regardless of my fingers, Aunt," Cassandra said, not looking up, so the risk seemed small. Lady Vane made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She was not an unkind woman, only a tired one, worn thin by the business of launching a daughter into society, with a fortune that did not entirely match the ambition behind it. Her own daughter, Portia, was the loveliest girl to come out in 3 seasons. Everyone said so. The newspapers had said so, and Lady Vane intended to spend every shilling she had proving it. "Portia is trying the rose silk again," Lady Vane said. "Come and tell me if the trim wants taking up. I have told you 3 times it does not. Tell me a 4th. It settles my nerves." Cassandra set down her needle and followed her aunt up the narrow servants' stair that connected the library to the family floors, because it was faster than the grand one, and because nobody minded if the poor cousin used the back of the house. She had lived at Varick House for 6 years, since her father's death had left her with his books, his debts, and nothing else, and in that time she had made herself so useful and so quiet that the household had stopped noticing she was there at all. She managed the account books that the steward was too proud to admit he could not balance. She catalogued the library that nobody but she ever entered. She translated the letters that arrived twice a year from a French cousin nobody remembered they had. She was, by any honest measure, the most competent person in the house, and by London's measure she did not exist. Portia stood on a low stool in the dressing room, turning slowly while a maid pinned the hem, and she was, Cassandra had to admit, breathtaking in the rose silk, gold hair catching the candlelight, cheeks flushed with the particular glow of a girl who has never once doubted she is the most interesting person in any room she enters. "Well," Portia said, not turning her head, "it is perfect. It was perfect an hour ago. Mother says the Duke of Rushden is to attend tonight. His grandmother forced him. Lady Ashcombe told me at the milliner's, and Lady Ashcombe never lies about anything that matters." Cassandra had heard the name before, the way one hears the names of weather systems, distant and unlikely to touch her personally. Julian Ferrers, Duke of Rushden, 28 years old, the most sought-after bachelor in 3 seasons running, famous for exquisite manners, famous for never once giving any woman reason to hope, famous, above all, for looking as though every ball he attended was a duty performed rather than a pleasure taken. "I am sure he will find you very fine," Cassandra said, and meant it, and turned to leave, because there was nothing further required of her here, and the mended Montaigne was waiting. She had nearly reached the door when the butler appeared with the post, and among the invitations and the bills was a single card addressed, in careful copperplate, to Miss Cassandra Merrick, Lady Vane snatched it before Cassandra could, turned it over, and went very still. "This cannot be right," Lady Vane said. "It was an Almack's voucher." Not one of the family's vouchers, renewed each year through the ordinary channels of connection and application that Lady Vane managed with the grim persistence of a general planning a campaign. This was a separate card, issued in Cassandra's name alone, bearing the small looping signature of Lady Jersey herself, one of the 6 patronesses who held, between them, more social power than the House of Lords. "There has been a clerical error," Lady Vane said, already composing the letter of polite correction in her head. "I will write to Lady Jersey's secretary in the morning." "Do not," Cassandra said, and surprised herself by the steadiness of her own voice. 2 years before, in the last week of a house party in Kent that Cassandra had attended only because her aunt needed a chaperone for Portia and could not spare the expense of hiring one, a small crisis had occurred that nobody but Cassandra had noticed. Lady Jersey, a guest of considerable rank and considerably worse patience, had brought with her a bundle of letters, decades old, written in French by a grandmother she had adored and lost, and a spilled cup of chocolate had ruined the ink on the most precious of them beyond any reading a normal eye could manage. The other guests had clucked sympathetically and moved on to cards. Cassandra had asked, quietly, if she might try. She had spent 4 nights by candlelight, holding the water-stained pages to the light at every angle, cross-referencing the surviving fragments against her father's old dictionaries, reconstructing sentence by sentence a letter about a garden in Provence and a daughter who had died young. She had transcribed it in a clean hand and returned both the original and the copy to Lady Jersey, without a word to anyone else in the house, because it had not occurred to her that the act deserved comment. Lady Jersey had read it in silence, folded it once, and said only, "You have given me my grandmother's voice back. I do not forget a debt like that, Miss Merrick." Cassandra had assumed, as one assumes about the promises of the very grand, that it was the kind of thing said in a moment of feeling and forgotten by breakfast. She had been wrong. The voucher in her hand was proof of it. "You cannot possibly mean to use it," Lady Vane said, recovering herself. "Cassandra, be sensible. You have no gown fit for Almack's. You have no dowry to speak of. What could you possibly hope to accomplish there, beyond embarrassing this family in front of every patroness in London?" "I do not intend to accomplish anything," Cassandra said. "I intend to see the room. I have read about it my whole life. I should like to see it once before I am too old to be permitted through the door at all. If you are settling in for this one, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now. It costs nothing, and it means the next story finds you the moment it is ready." Lady Vane argued for the better part of an hour, invoking propriety, expense, and the delicate ecosystem of Portia's prospects, all of which might apparently be disturbed by the presence of a poor cousin in a 5-year-old gown standing near the refreshment table. In the end, it was Lord Vane, roused from his study by the noise, who settled the matter with the weary logic of a man who did not care to argue twice about anything. "The girl has a voucher from Sarah Jersey herself," he said. "You cannot decline it without insulting her, and insulting Sarah Jersey is a faster way to ruin Portia's season than anything Cassandra could possibly do standing quietly by a punch bowl. Let her go. Buy her something plain and let it be done." The gown, when it arrived 4 days later, was plain indeed, a soft gray silk with no trim to speak of, chosen because it was the least expensive option the modiste had that could be finished in time. But Cassandra found, when she stood before the glass on Wednesday evening, that she did not mind it. It was the first gown she had owned in 6 years that had been made for her specifically, cut to her measurements rather than let out from something of Portia's, and there was a strange, private satisfaction in that alone. King Street at 10:30 was a crush of carriages, footmen shouting, torches guttering against a fine April drizzle, and the low, continuous roar of several hundred people determined to be seen arriving. The Vane carriage joined the queue behind a dozen others, and it was there, wedged between a barouche bearing an unfamiliar crest and a hackney some desperate gentleman had been forced to hire, That disaster nearly found them. A wheel struck a rut in the cobbles hard enough to crack the axle, and the carriage lurched to a stop a full street, short of the assembly rooms, with the clock at Almack's, visible through the window, showing 11 minutes to the hour. "We shall have to walk," Lord Vane said, already climbing down into the drizzle, offering his arm first to his wife, and then, belatedly, to his daughter, so that it was Cassandra who found herself walking last, unescorted, holding her gray skirts clear of the mud, counting the minutes against the clock face as it grew larger. She had heard the stories. Everyone had. The Duke of Wellington himself, hero of the age, victor of a continent, had been turned away from these doors twice, once for arriving 4 minutes past 11, and once, months later, for the crime of wearing trousers instead of the required knee breeches. If Wellington's title and Wellington's legend could not buy him past that door a single minute late, Cassandra's gray silk certainly would not. They reached the entrance with 90 seconds to spare. A footman in Almack's livery checked each card against a list, with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who had turned away better people than any of them, glanced once at the gentleman's dress, confirmed the required white cravats and dark coats, and the dreaded knee breeches were all correctly in order, and admitted them into the hall exactly as the clock began, somewhere above them, to strike the hour. The ballroom itself was smaller than Cassandra had imagined, and far more crowded, lit by chandeliers that threw a golden, slightly smoking light over several hundred silk gowns, the air already thick with the smell of melted wax, crushed orange flower water, and the sharp green scent of hothouse blooms wilting in the heat of so many bodies. There was no wine anywhere in sight. Long tables along one wall held only bread and butter cut absurdly thin, dry seed cake, and urns of tea, lemonade, and orgeat, refreshments so austere that Cassandra had heard men complain of them more bitterly than they ever complained of their tailors. At the head of the room, on a low dais that gave them a clear view of every arrival, sat the patronesses, 6 women who together decided who was and was not permitted to exist within the boundaries of fashionable London. Cassandra recognized them from description before she recognized their faces. Lady Jersey, sharp-eyed and never still, talking rapidly to Lady Cowper beside her. Lady Sefton, softer-featured, watching the door with something like genuine warmth. Princess Leven, dark-haired and imperious, the woman who had scandalized half the room 2 seasons ago by insisting the waltz be danced here at all. Lady Castlereagh, upright and formal. Mrs. Drummond Burrell, whose expression suggested she found the entire proceeding faintly disappointing. As Cassandra passed near the dais, Lady Jersey's gaze caught hers for exactly 1 second, no more, a flicker of recognition, and something that might have been approval, before moving on to the next arrival, as though nothing had happened at all. There Portia breathed, gripping Cassandra's wrist, hard enough to bruise. By the far pillar, that is him. The Duke of Rushden stood a full head above most of the men near him, dressed with the exact, unremarkable correctness the rooms demanded, dark coat, white cravat tied with more skill than effort, and he wore his beauty the way some men wear a title they were born too tired to appreciate. He was laughing at something a companion had said, and Cassandra, watching from 30 feet away, thought it was the most convincing performance of amusement she had ever seen on a face that showed no amusement at all behind the eyes. Word moved through the room the way water moves through a cracked vessel, fast and impossible to stop. This season, for the first time since Princess Leven had first scandalized the older members by bringing the waltz to these rooms some years before, the patronesses had determined that only one couple would open it. A single sanctioned dance chosen to demonstrate, publicly and carefully, that the new dance could be performed with perfect propriety before the wider room was permitted to attempt it themselves. The nomination, everyone understood, would fall to whichever gentleman among the highest company chose to make it, and every mother in the room had spent a fortnight positioning her daughter to be standing nearest him when the moment came. "He will choose me," Portia said, with the flat certainty of a girl who had never yet been told no by anyone whose opinion mattered. Mother has arranged it with Lady Jersey already. The introduction, everything. Cassandra found a spot near the edge of the room where the crowd thinned toward the tea urns, and there she stayed for the better part of an hour, watching. It was, she thought, a remarkably instructive way to spend an evening, standing at the exact point in a ballroom where nobody expected anything of her, close enough to see everything and invisible enough that no one troubled to perform for her benefit. She watched Portia execute a laugh, timed precisely to land within the Duke's hearing. She watched three separate mothers maneuver their daughters into his path, with the choreography of a military exercise. She watched the Duke greet each introduction with flawless, empty courtesy, and she watched, with growing and unwilling sympathy, the particular exhaustion of a man who has perfected the art of appearing delighted by things that delight him not at all. She did not see him watching her back, not at first. It was only when Portia, laughing too loudly at something Lord Fenwick had said, turned to include the room in her triumph and caught sight of Cassandra standing quietly by the tea table, that the evening's course changed. "Oh, Cassandra, do come and be introduced," Portia called, in the particular bright tone she used when she intended cruelty and wished it to sound like kindness. "Everyone, this is my cousin, Miss Merrick. She keeps our library in order. She is remarkably clever with old books, though I confess I have never once seen her open a new one." A ripple of polite laughter followed, the kind designed to include Cassandra in the joke only as its object. "I find old books rarely lie about what they are," Cassandra said, before she could decide whether it was wise to say anything at all, which is more than I can say for most conversation at a ball. The laughter shifted briefly, genuinely, and Portia's smile thinned by a fraction. Lord Fenwick, a florid young man with more confidence than sense, seized the opening with the eagerness of someone who had drunk more lemonade than was good for him and mistaken it for courage. "A wit among the wallflowers," he said, stepping closer, looking Cassandra over with the frank, assessing rudeness of a man appraising a horse. "Tell me, Miss Merrick, do the books complain when you touch them with hands like that? I understand you do the mending yourself, no lady's maid for the labor." He reached, with theatrical delicacy, for her hand, meaning to display it to the small crowd as evidence of her supposed unsuitability, and Cassandra, who had spent 6 years absorbing exactly this species of insult without flinching, kept her hand at her side and her expression perfectly composed. Though something in her chest had gone very tight and very cold, it was from 30 feet away, near the pillar, that the Duke of Rushden set down his glass. He crossed the room without appearing to hurry, which was somehow worse for the effect, a man moving at his own unhurried pace through a crowd that parted for him instinctively, and he arrived at the small circle around Fenwick with an expression of mild, terrible politeness that made the florid young man's hand drop back to his side before it had touched anything at all. "Fenwick," the Duke said, "I find I have not yet been introduced to Miss Merrick, and I dislike hearing a lady discussed as though she cannot hear the discussion. Would you do me the courtesy of stepping back a pace? You are standing rather closer to her than the dance requires, and we have not yet begun to dance." It was said lightly, almost pleasantly, and it was also entirely unmistakable. Fenwick stepped back a pace, muttered something about no offense meant, and retreated toward the card room with the particular speed of a man who has just understood, half a second too late, exactly how much trouble he had nearly caused himself. The Duke turned to Cassandra. Up close he was less golden and more tired than he had appeared from across the room, faint shadows beneath eyes that were a pale, unremarkable gray, and there was, beneath the flawless manners, something watchful in the way he looked at her, as though he were checking a fact against a memory. "I do apologize for the interruption," he said. "I understand you keep a library in exceptional order. I have heard something of it." "You have heard something of it," Cassandra repeated, startled into bluntness. "From whom, your grace? I was not aware anyone outside my uncle's house had noticed." Lady Jersey mentioned a Miss Merrick who once returned her grandmother's voice to her out of a ruined letter, and asked for nothing in return, the Duke said. I confess I have thought about that story rather more than I ought to admit at a ball. Most people I meet in these rooms want something the moment they learn my name. It is unusual to meet someone who did a kindness and did not think to attach herself to the memory of it. Across the room, the small orchestra tuning near the dais fell silent, and a hush moved through the crowd the way it does before an announcement. And Lady Jersey rose from the dais with the unhurried authority of a woman who had never once needed to raise her voice to be heard. The waltz, Lady Jersey announced, will be opened this evening by His Grace the Duke of Rushden, and by whichever lady he chooses to honor with the invitation. Every woman in the room went very still, in the particular way of 100 people simultaneously, trying not to appear to be holding their breath. Portia, 12 feet away, arranged her face into an expression of demure surprise, already halfway to a curtsy, already certain. The Duke of Rushden did not look at Portia at all. He looked at Cassandra, standing by the tea-urns in her plain gray gown, with a needle-scared hand she had not managed to hide quite in time, and he held out his own hand, palm up, in the exact center of a silent room. "Miss Merrick," he said, "would you do me the very great honor of the waltz?" Somewhere near the pillar, a glass slipped from someone's fingers and struck the floor without breaking, the sound absurdly loud in the silence that followed. Cassandra looked at the offered hand, and then at the 6 patronesses watching from the dais with 6 entirely different expressions, and then at her aunt, whose face had gone the color of old parchment, and then finally at the Duke himself, who was watching her with the particular stillness of a man who has said something true for the first time in longer than he can remember and is waiting, without any confidence at all, to find out if it will be believed. "I do not know the waltz well, Your Grace," Cassandra said, which was true, and which was also, she understood even as she said it, entirely beside the point. "Neither, I suspect, does anyone else in this room," the Duke said. "Princess Leven only brought it to us a few years ago, and half of London is still pretending to have known it from the cradle. We shall be equally at sea, Miss Merrick. I find that preferable to dancing with someone who already knows exactly what she is doing." She put her hand in his. His grip was warm and careful, and as the orchestra found the first slow bars of the 3/4 time, and the crowd drew back to give them the floor entirely to themselves, Cassandra understood, with the particular clarity that comes only at the exact center of a catastrophe, that whatever her life had been an hour ago, it would not be that life again. The waltz, danced correctly, requires a closeness that no other permitted dance of the era allows. His hand at her waist, hers resting lightly on his shoulder, their bodies turning in a slow, continuous circle that the older patronesses had scandalized half of London by permitting at all. Cassandra was acutely aware of every eye in the room, of the particular silence of several hundred people watching the steps of 2 people who had never once, until this evening, exchanged more than a dozen words. "You are counting," the Duke said, low enough that only she could hear it. "I am terrified," Cassandra said. "There is a difference, but I am attempting to disguise the second as the first." Something in his face shifted, not quite a smile. Something rarer and more genuine than the practiced charm he had worn all evening. "You are the only honest person I have spoken to in this room tonight, and you have been in it for less than 2 hours. That is either a remarkable coincidence or a very damning statement about the rest of us. I think it is simply that no one expects honesty from someone standing by the tea-urns," Cassandra said. "It is a very freeing position, Your Grace. Nobody watches the tea-urns closely enough to catch you in anything. I have been watched closely enough, for long enough, that I have nearly forgotten what it is to say a true thing and not calculate its effect before I say it," the Duke said, and there was something raw beneath the words that made Cassandra look up at him properly for the first time, past the practiced beauty of his face to the tiredness underneath it. "My grandmother made me come tonight. She said I had grown so smooth that she could no longer tell what I actually thought about anything, and she wished to see if a room full of strangers could shock an honest reaction out of me. I did not expect it to work. And has it?" I asked a woman I had spoken to for 90 seconds to dance the most talked about waltz of the season in front of 6 patronesses, and everyone who matters in London, the Duke said. I would call that a reaction, Miss Merrick. I am not entirely certain it was a wise one. The music turned them again, and across the floor Cassandra caught, for one unguarded instant, the expression on her cousin's face. And it was not anger exactly. It was something colder and more calculating, the particular look of a girl recalculating an equation she had believed already solved. The waltz lasted 4 minutes. It felt, to Cassandra, like the entire length of her life, until that point compressed into a single held breath. And when the final notes fell away and the Duke bowed over her hand with the exact correct formality the room demanded, the applause that followed was polite, general, and utterly failed to disguise the fact that every single person present had just witnessed something they would be discussing for a fortnight. The Duke escorted her from the floor with his hand at her elbow, and it was only as they reached the edge of the crowd that Lady Jersey herself intercepted them, expression unreadable, and said, quietly enough that only the 3 of them could hear it, Well, Your Grace, I believe you have just given this season its first genuine subject of conversation. I hope you understand precisely what you have done. I believe I do, the Duke said, and looked at Cassandra as he said it, in a way that made her understand, with a small drop of pure vertigo, that whatever had happened in the last 4 minutes had not been an accident, a whim, or an act of mercy performed on a bored young man's spontaneous impulse. It had been, somehow, a decision made with intention by a man who did not seem to make many of those anymore. The carriage ride home was silent in the way a held breath is silent. Portia stared out of the window with a fixed, brittle expression. Lady Vane's fan snapped open and shut with a rhythm that suggested she was composing several furious speeches simultaneously and could not decide which to deliver first. It was not until they had reached Varick House and the front door had closed behind them that the first of the speeches arrived. Do you have any conception, Lady Vane said, of what you have done to this family's standing tonight? A duke, dancing the season's single-sanctioned waltz with the poor relation, in front of every patroness in London. People will say you contrived it. People will say worse than that. Do you imagine, for one moment, that Portia's chances have not been damaged by this? Do you imagine mine have? I did not contrive anything, Aunt, Cassandra said, with a calm that surprised even herself, the strange clear calm that sometimes follows an evening too large to fully absorb in the space of a single carriage ride home. I stood by the tea urns. He crossed the room. I did not ask him to. Then you will simply have to endure what follows, Lady Vane said, because I promise you, something will follow. A man like that does not offer a public spectacle without consequence, and I very much doubt the consequence will favor a girl with 11 shillings and a mended dress to her name. If you have gotten this far, and you are already dreading how this ends for her, take a breath, subscribe, and trust that this story pays what it promises. We are only halfway there. Lady Vane's prediction proved, within 3 days, entirely correct, though not in the direction she had feared. It was not ruin that arrived at Varick House on the Saturday following the ball. It was a note on the Duke of Rushden's own crested paper, requesting the honor of calling upon Miss Merrick at 2:30, and beneath the formal language, in the Duke's own hand, rather than a secretary's, a single line that made Cassandra's breath catch when she read it alone in the library that morning. I find I have thought of very little else since Wednesday. I hope that is not an unwelcome confession from a man you have known for the length of one dance. He arrived precisely on time, dressed with the same unremarkable correctness he had worn at Almack's, and Lady Vane, torn between fury and the sudden dawning recognition that a duke calling upon her niece was not, in fact, a catastrophe, but possibly the single greatest opportunity to fall into her lap in a decade, arranged herself in the drawing room with a rigidity that suggested she was holding an entire speech behind her teeth by force of will alone. I wondered, the Duke said. Once the necessary pleasantries had been exchanged and Lady Vane had settled, unconvincingly, into the pretense of needlework by the far window. If Miss Merrick might show me the library I have heard so much praised. I am told the collection is remarkable. It was, Cassandra understood, a request designed with surgical precision to remove them both from Lady Vane's direct hearing while remaining, technically, entirely proper, and she led him down the narrow stair she used herself, into the room that smelled of leather and wax and the particular dry sweetness of very old paper. "This is where you spend your days," the Duke said, looking around at the shelves with an attention that seemed, unlike most of the attention Cassandra had observed him pay to things, entirely genuine. "I begin to understand why the tea urns did not intimidate you at all. You had already spent 6 years in a room far more demanding than any ballroom. It is quieter than a ballroom, at least," Cassandra said. "Books do not require you to perform delight you do not feel." Something crossed his face, quick and unguarded, and he crossed to the window rather than answering immediately, looking out at the small, unremarkable garden below with his back half turned to her. "You noticed that, at the ball, that I was performing." "I noticed it before you crossed the room," Cassandra said. "I had been watching you for the better part of an hour before that, Your Grace, the way one watches whether one expects to have to walk through eventually. You are very good at it. I do not think anyone else in that room noticed at all." "My grandmother noticed," the Duke said quietly. "She is the only person left who remembers what I was like before I learned how to do it well. She has been trying to force me back into an honest reaction for 2 years now, dragging me to balls I have no interest in attending, introducing me to women I have no interest in marrying, hoping something would finally crack the performance enough to let the actual person out again." He turned back to face her. "I did not expect it to be a woman standing quietly by the tea urns who managed it in under 2 hours. Why did you stop performing, Your Grace? If I may ask something so direct." He was quiet long enough that Cassandra thought he might decline to answer at all, and when he did speak, his voice had dropped into something rougher and less practiced than anything she had heard from him yet. "Because you told Fenwick that old books do not lie about what they are, and I realized I could not remember the last time I had said anything to anyone that was not, in some fashion, a lie of omission. I have spent so long being exactly what every room requires me to be that I had begun to suspect there was nothing left underneath it worth finding. It seemed suddenly worth finding out whether that was true. And is it true?" "I do not know yet," the Duke said, "but I find I would like the chance to discover it in your company, if you would permit that, rather than performing my way through another season, pretending I already know the answer." Cassandra did not answer immediately. She thought of the 6 years of invisibility that had preceded this single, improbable afternoon, of a lifetime spent being useful and unremarked, and she thought, too, of the particular danger in a man's interest that had arrived so suddenly and so publicly, the danger that it might be gratitude mistaken for something deeper, or novelty mistaken for genuine regard, the kind of thing that burns bright for a fortnight and leaves nothing behind but a worse loneliness than before. "I do not want to be your reaction, Your Grace," she said finally, carefully. "I do not want to be the thing that proved you could still feel something, only to discover, once the feeling has been proven possible, that it settles on someone else entirely. I have watched that happen to women before. I would rather remain invisible than be temporary." It was, she thought afterward, the most honest thing she had ever said to anyone outside this room, and the Duke received it not with offense, but with something that looked almost like relief, as though her refusal to accept easy comfort had told him something important about the depth of the thing he was offering. "Then I will not ask you to believe it yet," he said. "I will ask only for the chance to prove it is not that, over time, in whatever manner you find acceptable. I am not accustomed to being told no, Miss Merrick. I find I do not mind it nearly so much when the reason given is a good one." Word of the Duke's call spread through the ton with the particular speed reserved for gossip involving a title, and by the following Wednesday, when the Vane carriage once again joined the queue on King Street, The crowd's reaction to Cassandra's arrival had transformed entirely from the polite indifference of a fortnight before into something far more dangerous, a room full of people watching her every gesture for evidence of either triumph or ruin. It was Lady Portia, in the end, who supplied the ruin they were hoping for. "I understand my cousin has been receiving private calls from His Grace," Portia said, to a small circle gathered near the card room, pitched just loudly enough to carry, sweetness layered thick over something far sharper beneath it. "One does wonder what a girl with 11 shillings and no connections offers a man of his consequence, beyond, of course, whatever she offered him alone in a library with no chaperone present but the servants." The insinuation landed exactly where it was aimed, and Cassandra felt the room's attention shift, felt the particular cold weight of several dozen people recalculating their opinion of her in real time, and understood, with a sick drop in her stomach, that a rumor of impropriety, once spoken aloud in a room like this one, could not be unspoken no matter how false it was. The Duke arrived on the floor before Cassandra had found a single word to answer with. He had not heard Portia's words directly. The crowd and the orchestra had swallowed most of it before it reached him, but he had watched the shift in the room, the sudden angle of a dozen fans turned to hide a dozen whispering mouths, and he had learned enough of London in 28 years to read the shape of a rumor taking hold even from 30 feet away. "Miss Vane," he said, arriving at Portia's elbow with a courtesy so exact it verged on a blade, "I wonder if you would do me the kindness of repeating whatever you have just said, a little louder this time, so that I might correct it directly, rather than leaving it to travel the room in whatever shape it has already taken." Portia's composure did not crack, quite, but it thinned considerably. "I said nothing that was not perfectly innocent, Your Grace. Merely that my cousin had received a private call from you, unchaperoned but for the servants. She received a call from me in her own family's library at 2:30 in the afternoon, with your mother seated not 30 feet away in the same room, occupied with her needlework," the Duke said, in a voice pitched precisely to carry to the small crowd that had gathered, no louder, no angrier, simply clear. "I am aware London enjoys a story more than it enjoys a fact, but I would ask that whoever repeats this one in future include the detail of Lady Vane's presence, since I understand accuracy is meant to matter even in gossip." Lady Vane, who had indeed been present and had spent the entire visit failing to concentrate on a single stitch, found herself abruptly and uncomfortably promoted to chief witness for the defense, and confirmed the Duke's account with a stiff nod that cost her considerable pride to deliver in front of half the room. It was not, Cassandra understood later, a complete victory. A denied rumor travels almost as far as a confirmed one, and by the time the carriages queued once more on King Street the following week, there were still those in London who preferred the more interesting version of events to the dull, chaperoned truth. But it was enough, that night, to keep the worst of the damage from settling, and it was the first time in 6 years that anyone had stood in a public room and corrected an insult made at Cassandra's expense before she had been forced to absorb it alone. If you are the kind of listener who likes to see cruelty answered before the credits roll, you already know why this channel is worth the subscribe. Go ahead and tap it, then come back. There is more story yet. The following fortnight unfolded in the particular, suffocating slowness of a scandal that has been contained but not resolved. The Duke called twice more, always with Lady Vane present, always correct in every particular that London's rules demanded, and each visit left Cassandra more certain of him and more frightened of exactly how much she had come to want something she had spent 6 years training herself not to want at all. It was on the third visit, in the garden behind Varick House, rather than the library, the two of them walking a gravel path within full view of the drawing-room windows, and therefore entirely proper, that the Duke finally told her the thing he had been circling for a fortnight. "You asked me once why I stopped performing," he said, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the middle distance, the way a man looks when he is about to say something he has rehearsed and still fears. "I gave you half an answer. I should give you the rest of it, if you are willing to hear it, because I think you deserve to know exactly what you would be marrying into, should it come to that." "I am willing," Cassandra said. "My mother was the most vivid person I have ever known," the Duke said. "Not vivid in the way society uses the word to mean merely fashionable. She laughed too loudly for drawing rooms. She argued politics with my father's friends and was usually right. She was, by every account I have ever heard from people who knew her, before I was old enough to remember her clearly, entirely herself in every room she entered, and London adored her for it, right up until the year I turned 9, when a paper printed a story about a friendship she had with a gentleman, not my father. A friendship that was, by every honest account I have since been able to gather, entirely innocent and entirely misread. What happened to her? She spent the rest of her life trying to prove a negative," the Duke said, "which is, as I imagine you understand better than most, an impossible task. She grew quieter every year after that story ran. She stopped laughing too loudly. She stopped arguing politics. By the time she died, I do not think there was very much of the woman London had once adored left in the house at all, only a careful, watchful shadow of her, terrified of giving anyone anything further to print. I watched that happen, from the age of 9 onward, and I concluded, somewhere in the process of watching it, that the only way to survive being watched that closely was to give the watchers nothing true to find. So I built the version of myself that has stood in every ballroom for the last decade, pleasant, correct, entirely empty of anything a scandal sheet could use against me, and I have been so successful at it that I very nearly forgot there was anyone underneath it left to protect." Cassandra stopped walking. "And now?" "Now I have discovered that the cost of that protection was becoming precisely the kind of hollow, performing creature my mother's ruin frightened her into becoming, only I did it to myself, without anyone forcing me at all," the Duke said. "You stood by a tea urn and told a fool that old books do not lie about what they are, and it was the first true sentence I had heard spoken aloud in a ballroom in longer than I can remember, and I wanted, more than I have wanted anything in a decade, to find out if I still had a true sentence left in me, too." It was, Cassandra thought, the most honest confession any man had ever offered her, and it changed nothing at all about the practical dangers still circling them both, the whispers not fully silenced, the family that would gain everything from this match, and the family that would lose its dearest ambition if it succeeded. But it changed, entirely, the private certainty she carried afterward that whatever came next, it would not be built on gratitude or novelty. It would be built on two people who had each, independently, learned to disappear in order to survive being watched, and who had found in each other the first room in years where disappearing no longer felt necessary. In the ordinary days between that confession in the garden and whatever trouble the world intended to send next, nothing about Cassandra's daily life changed at all, and she found she was grateful for it. She still rose early and went down to the library before the rest of the house had stirred. She still balanced the steward's accounts, which had grown no more accurate for the passage of a fortnight, and it was on one such ordinary morning, 3 days after the garden, that she found an error in the household ledger large enough to matter. A coal merchant billing Varick House for deliveries the cellar records did not support, a discrepancy of nearly £11 across a single quarter. She brought it, as she always had, to her uncle rather than to the Duke, because it was not the Duke's household to correct, and she had never once, in 6 years, allowed her usefulness to depend on who might be impressed by it. Lord Vane, reading over her figures with the particular surprise of a man who had genuinely forgotten how much of his own comfort depended on a niece he rarely thought to thank, said only, "You ought to have been born a son, Cassandra. You would have run this estate into a fortune rather than out of one." It was not quite an apology for 6 years of being overlooked, but it was, she thought, as close as he was likely to come, and she accepted it in the spirit it was offered. She mentioned the incident to the Duke only in passing, days later, expecting no particular reaction, and was startled to find he remembered every detail of it a week on, asking after the coal merchant by name, asking whether Lord Vane had pursued the matter with the man directly. "You did not tell me that story to impress me," he said, when she pointed out how closely he had listened to something so small. "That is precisely why I have not stopped thinking about it. Everyone I have ever courted has told me stories designed to be admired. You told me one about a coal bill, because it happened to you, and it happened to be interesting. I find I would like to hear a great many more stories told for no better reason than that." The counter-move, when it came, arrived from a direction neither of them had thought to guard. Lord Fenwick, humiliated at the ball, and eager to recover both his pride and the attention of a family he had hoped to court through Portia, took it upon himself to visit a gentleman of his acquaintance who wrote occasional items for one of the less scrupulous society papers, and within the week a paragraph appeared, unsigned, coy with initials rather than names, but transparent enough that all of London understood exactly whom it described, suggesting that a certain duke's sudden interest in a certain penniless cousin had rather less to do with honest feeling, and rather more to do with a wager laid among his set, a bet as to whether he could induce a plain, unconnected girl to believe herself loved before the season's end. It was a lie built with the particular cruelty of lies that are impossible to fully disprove, and it arrived at Varick House on a Tuesday morning folded inside the ordinary post, and Cassandra read it standing in the library, with her father's mended Montaigne still open on the desk beside her, and felt something in her chest go cold and small and very quiet. She did not cry. She had trained herself, across 6 years of small daily humiliations, not to cry where anyone might see it, and there was, in any case, no one in the library to see it now. She simply closed the paper, set it beneath a stack of ledgers where her aunt would not immediately find it, and sat for a long while in the particular gray stillness of a woman deciding whether to believe the worst thing anyone has ever suggested about someone she has allowed herself to trust. The Duke arrived that same afternoon, before she had decided anything at all, carrying his own copy of the paper, already creased from having been read and reread on the carriage ride over. "I did not lay a wager," he said, before Lady Vane had even finished announcing him, before the customary pleasantries could establish themselves between them. "I want that said plainly, first, before anything else. There is no wager. There has never been a wager. I do not know which of my acquaintance invented this, though I have a fair suspicion, and I intend to deal with him directly. But I did not want you sitting with that lie for 1 hour longer than necessary, believing it might be true." "I had not entirely decided it was false," Cassandra said, with the same brutal honesty she had offered him from the very first evening, because she had learned, in the fortnight since, that it was the only currency between them worth spending. "I wanted to believe it was false. That is not quite the same thing as certainty, Your Grace." "Then let me offer you certainty instead of merely asking for trust," the Duke said, and reached into his coat and withdrew, of all things, a small dance card, the kind given out at every Almack's Wednesday for ladies to record their partners upon, blank but for a single line filled in his own hand, in ink slightly smudged where he had clearly written it in some haste. It bore her name at the top, and beneath it, in every space meant for a different partner across an entire evening, the same single word repeated 8 times over: Rushden, 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 Rushden. "I had it made up before the Fenwick business ever surfaced," he said, "as a foolish sentimental sort of promise to myself that whatever came of this season, I did not intend to spend it dancing with anyone else, real waltz or no waltz. I meant to give it to you properly, at the next Wednesday, with rather more ceremony than standing in your aunt's drawing room, holding a scandal sheet in my other hand. But I find I would rather give it to you now, badly timed as it is, so that you have something in your own hand that is entirely true, to weigh against something in the papers that is entirely false." Cassandra took the card. It was a small, absurd object, cheap paper and a few lines of ink, and it undid something in her chest that 6 years of careful invisibility had built brick by brick, because it was, she understood, precisely the opposite of a wager. A wager requires an audience and a payoff and an ending. This required nothing but the private, repeated insistence of one name, over and over, where any other name might easily have gone. "I believe you," she said, and found that she meant it entirely. They agreed, that afternoon, that the surest answer to a whispered lie was not private reassurance, but public correction, delivered in the one room in London where correction, once spoken by the right voice, could not be undone by gossip afterward. The following Wednesday, Almack's queue on King Street was, if anything, longer and more curious than it had been a fortnight before, every carriage disgorging passengers eager to see how the Duke of Rushden would answer the paragraph that had set all of London talking. He answered it before the doors had properly opened for the evening's dancing. He requested, and was granted, a moment before the assembled room, an unusual liberty that only a man of his standing, and only the patroness's considerable curiosity could have permitted, and he stood before several hundred of the most powerful gossips in England, with Cassandra's hand resting, deliberately, visibly, on his arm. "I understand a story has circulated this fortnight," he said, in the same clear, unhurried voice he had used to correct Portia weeks before, suggesting that my attentions to Miss Merrick were the subject of a wager among my acquaintance. I will say this once, plainly, so that it need not be repeated in whispers afterward. There was no wager. There has never been a wager. What there has been, since the evening several of you witnessed on this very floor, is a growing and entirely sincere regard for a woman who told a roomful of strangers an honest thing when she had every reason to expect it would go unheard, and who has continued to tell me honest things ever since, at some personal cost, when it would have been considerably easier for her to simply agree with whatever I wished to hear. He turned to Lady Jersey, seated in her customary place on the dais. "I am aware this is an unorthodox use of your rooms, Lady Jersey, and I apologize for the disruption, but I did not wish to correct a lie about her in private, and allow the lie itself to remain the version London remembers." Lady Jersey regarded him for a long moment, and then looked at Cassandra, and something in her sharp, assessing face softened into an expression that might, in a less formidable woman, have been called fondness. "I told you once, Miss Merrick, that I do not forget a debt. I find I am glad to have been proven right about the character of the woman I owed it to." She rose and inclined her head, the smallest fraction, toward the Duke. "Your Grace, I believe the room has heard you clearly. I do not imagine there is a person present foolish enough to repeat that particular paragraph again." There was no one foolish enough, as it happened. Lord Fenwick, understanding precisely how thoroughly and publicly he had been outmaneuvered, quit London for his family's estate within the fortnight, and did not return until well after the season had ended. The paragraph itself was never formally retracted. Scandal papers rarely troubled themselves with retractions, but it withered from want of anyone willing to repeat it, and by the time the roses came into bloom along King Street, the story London told about the Duke of Rushden and the quiet cousin from the library had settled, finally, into the one version that had been true from the very beginning. They were married in June, quietly, at the small stone church nearest the Duke's country estate, with a guest list so short that Lady Vane spent the better part of the ceremony recalculating, with visible effort, how she intended to describe its exclusivity to her friends as a mark of taste, rather than a mark of how few people had truly mattered to either bride or groom. Portia did not attend, having accepted, with considerably less fanfare than she had once imagined for herself, an offer from a perfectly amiable baronet some weeks prior, a match that suited her rather better than she would ever admit aloud. Cassandra wore gray again, at her own insistence, a finer silk than the gown from Almack's, but the same quiet color. And when the Duke's grandmother, the dowager who had dragged her grandson to that first Wednesday out of nothing more than stubborn hope, took Cassandra's hands before the ceremony began, the old woman studied her for a long moment with eyes that missed very little. "He wore his face like a mask for 2 years, the dowager said. I had begun to fear it had grown into his skin permanently. Whatever you did to him, girl, I do not require the details. I require only that you continue doing it." She pressed something small and cold into Cassandra's palm, an old ring, worn thin with age. "This was mine before it was his mother's. I could not bring myself to give it to a woman who would only wear it as another piece of the performance. I find I have no such reservation with you." The vicar's words that afternoon were brief and unremarkable, the church small enough that every voice carried without effort, and when the Duke slid the dowager's ring onto Cassandra's finger, his hands were, for the first time since she had known him, visibly unsteady, a small human tremor in a man who had spent a decade training every part of himself to appear composed. She thought, watching it, that she would remember that tremor longer than she remembered almost anything else about the day, longer than the flowers or the vows or the modest wedding breakfast that followed. It was proof, small and undeniable, that whatever else had been performance between them at the start, this at least was not. Cassandra kept the library at her new home exactly as she had kept the one at Varick House, in careful, quiet order, though she no longer catalogued it alone. The Duke took to spending his mornings there, beside her, ostensibly attending to estate correspondence, in practice reading over her shoulder, and asking questions about French grammar he did not strictly need answered, simply for the pleasure of hearing her explain something she loved to a person who had finally learned to listen. The dance card lived, framed, on the wall above her writing desk, 8 lines of a single repeated name in slightly smudged ink, the least valuable object in a house full of considerably finer things, and, by unanimous private agreement between the two people who mattered, the most treasured one in it. On the evening of their first wedding anniversary, the Duke presented her with a second card, filled out this time with rather more care and considerably less haste, every line still bearing the same single word, and told her, with the dry, unhurried honesty she had first heard from him across a crowded ballroom, that he intended to fill out a fresh one every year for the rest of their lives, so that neither of them would ever again have reason to doubt where his name belonged. If Cassandra and Julian's quiet, hard-won happiness moved you tonight, that is exactly why this channel exists. Stories about the ones society overlooks until they cannot be overlooked any longer. Hit like, share it with someone who still believes in a slow, honest kind of love, and subscribe to Regency Lullabies, so the next one finds you the moment it is ready. Tell me in the comments, would you have trusted the dance card, or would you have needed more convincing than Cassandra did? I will see you in the next story.